livestock is obviously a central question for rural livelihoods, because at least in pastoral areas in many countries, what is your main source of transportation, of wealth storage, and of food is all wrapped up into one creature. So this is obviously a very, very important aspect of livelihoods. The reason that we're interested in livestock populations is because we perceive them as being vulnerable. Things like climate change and desertification have rendered these populations particularly vulnerable, but the same reasons that we're interested in them make the data particularly difficult to collect. Livestock populations are usually spread out over vast areas of land. The terrain is usually very inhospitable. It's dry or it's arid. And as well, a lot of pastoralist areas are conflict prone, and there's been a history of instability in these areas. So because of these challenges, livestock data is inherently difficult to collect, and this is piled on top of sort of the general challenges that you have with data collection in terms of quantification and measurement error and missing values, etc. So most of my work in livestock data collection has been in the pastoralist areas of eastern Ethiopia, and these areas are home to large nomadic and semi-nomadic populations. Basically, livestock is the dominant livelihood for these areas. One of the challenges that we had, though, is the way we traditionally think of doing household surveys. We use dwelling-based surveys. So we have a list from the census of enumeration areas, we select new enumeration areas, and then within those enumeration areas we select dwellings. But if you have a mobile population that doesn't either have a year-long or a year-round dwelling, or that cannot be reliably found at their dwelling, this method of data collection will undercount this population. So in these pastoral areas of eastern Ethiopia, trying to actually figure out the population that we were trying to count and the best way to access that population was particularly difficult. So we decided that we would do something a little bit different. We would use something called a random geographic cluster survey in order to try to reach these populations. And whereas traditional surveys use a dwelling-based frame, this uses an area-based frame. So in this case, we use GIS maps to create stratification based on the likelihood of finding a herd. So if you think about areas where you're likely to find livestock, would be areas near settlements, areas near transportation sources or markets, or areas near water. So we created stratification based on the likelihood of finding a herd, and then what we did is, instead of selecting enumeration areas, we selected points within our strata. And these points were they could be selected over the continuous space, and then we essentially opened a beach umbrella around that point. And anything in the shade of our beach umbrella, anything within a defined radius around this point, became a temporary enumeration area. And we sent our enumerators out, and they surveyed all livestock holding households within this enumeration area. So in this way, populations don't have to be resident at their place where they're found for more than a few hours, because all of the enumeration for a given point was done in a day. This was the first time that we know of that this was done for a large-scale data collection project in Africa. And we encountered a number of different challenges. The area that we were working with had some civil unrest, so we had incidents of violence against our enumerators and our staff. It was during the dry period, so the temperatures were over 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, so we were asking enumerators to go out, and sometimes they had to walk up to 15 kilometers from the nearest road access point to where these points were selected and where these herds were found. In addition, many of these areas were inhospitable, and we needed local guides to navigate rocky areas, navigate crossings of rivers, and to know sort of the best way to cover the entire terrain. So in that case, we were very reliant on local populations in order to assist us in our data collection process. So the findings from this paper are currently under review for publication, but basically they say that approximately 2 to 3% of pastoralist households are completely nomadic, or nomadic in a way that they would not be captured by a dwelling-based frame. In this way, sort of the traditional dwelling frames are not necessarily bad in that they're drastically undercounting. Other areas that we looked at, though, is that this data is actually a little bit less expensive to collect because of the sample size and the way it's it's designed, you get higher levels of precision for fewer numbers of households. So because of these benefits, the government of Ethiopia has decided to use this method of data collection for their agricultural census for the livestock portion in the pastoral areas of the country. So they decided, despite the limitations that we have in this method, that it was the best way going forward and sort of the best of the worst. In relation to that, there's a number of different things that we're working on with the government of Ethiopia in order to improve this methodology. The reason this is even possible is because of the availability of satellite data and GIS mapping, but there's much more information that we can incorporate into these data sets, improve the probability of us finding a herd, and this will further reduce survey costs as we are more likely to go to the right places at the right time. It's very difficult to try to give you a sense of the exact cost because so much is dependent on the terrain in which this will be implemented. In Ethiopia, because the terrain was very sparse, the cost was a little bit less. The main benefit in terms of precision for the given sample size is that we interview all the households within a given area. So this reduces kind of the design effect on our statistics and gives more precise calculations for a given sample size. So the types of indicators that we collected were related to major livestock events: births, deaths, vaccinations. Theft is also a big issue in the areas in which we were working. I would be hesitant to say that this data set could be used as a replacement for dwelling-based data, because the benefit that we saw in capturing this small number of additional households was somewhat offset by the fact that this is a new methodology and that there are growing pains and that there are still some things that need to be worked out, particularly with the targeting and the stratification, as well as for getting full coverage. One of the things we noticed is that occasionally the interviewers didn't cover the entire area for which they were supposed to cover, and this could be a function of perhaps interviewer fatigue, or it could be an issue that just cannot be resolved. There are limits to what human beings can be expected to do, and walking 6 or 7 hours in 120-degree heat might just be beyond what is feasible in terms of asking people to implement a survey. So at this point, the data certainly will be available and we would be happy to share it, but there are still limitations on the methodology that I think need to be worked out before we consider this an alternative to some of the other more traditional data collection methods. So there's a number of research gaps that need to be addressed with livestock data. Quantification is very difficult. I mean, if you think about something like milk production, this is obviously a major source of calories. In the place that we were working in Afar, it is the main source of calories for a number of months during the year. But the quantification of milk production, trying to value milk production, trying to deal with the fact that in addition to milking these animals, there's also suckling going on. So these are all very important issues that I don't think we have necessarily a firm answer for yet. And so I think that's a good example of a number of different types of issues and quantification issues that have come up in livestock. And as livestock is increasingly recognized as an important source of well-being for rural populations, I think we need to focus on better quantifying these types of outputs.